Welcome back to your channel. Before we begin our journey, we'd love to get to know our wonderful family around the world. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Thank you, enjoy the show, and let us know if you like the story. The royal citadel of Ethelgard was a masterpiece of alabaster and gold, a sprawling labyrinth of vaulted ceilings, whispering galleries, and manicured gardens that bloomed with unnatural perfection. It was a place where the air was eternally thick with the scent of crushed roses and burning frankincense, where every surface gleamed with the polish of immense wealth. Yet, to Princess Alara, the sole heir to the throne, this magnificent palace was nothing more than a beautifully gilded cage. She spent her days draped in heavy silks and suffocating corsets, her neck weighed down by diamonds that felt more like chains than adornments. She was expected to be a portrait of royal grace, silent and smiling, a pawn to be moved across the political chessboard by her father, King Aldrich. But beneath the stoic exterior, Alara's spirit was a restless tempest. She possessed a mind that hungered for the world beyond the towering obsidian walls that encircled the palace, a world she could only hear as a distant, muffled hum of life. Her only solace was the western perimeter of the royal gardens, a neglected, overgrown patch of ancient willow trees and tangled ivy that pressed right against the colossal iron gate. This gate was the singular barrier between the pristine serenity of the palace and the chaotic, vibrant reality of the lower city. It was here, hidden within the shadows of the weeping willows, that Alara first saw him. His name was Kalen. He was one of the many guards assigned to the outer perimeter, a lowly gatekeeper whose existence was barely registered by the passing nobility. But to Alara, observing him secretly from the safety of the foliage, he was the most fascinating creature in the kingdom. Unlike the royal guards who stood rigid and pompous in their gleaming silver armor, Kalen wore the simple, boiled leather tunic of the city watch. The leather was scuffed and worn, molding perfectly to the broad, muscular lines of his shoulders and chest. His hair was the color of dark roasted chestnuts, falling in unruly waves over a face that looked as though it had been carved by the wind and the sun. He had a strong jaw shadowed by a rough scruff, but it was his eyes that captivated her. From a distance, they seemed to hold the color of a stormy sea, deep and turbulent, yet infinitely calm. What drew Alara to him initially was not just his rugged, untamed beauty, but the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. During his long, solitary watches, when he thought no one was looking, Kalen would pull a battered, leather-bound book from inside his tunic. He would read with a fierce, consuming intensity, his lips moving silently over the words, his calloused fingers turning the fragile pages with unexpected reverence. He was a man of the dirt, a commoner bound to the lowest rungs of society, yet his mind was clearly soaring through the heavens of literature and philosophy. For weeks, Alara was content merely to watch him. She would slip away from her tutors and ladies-in-waiting, wrapping herself in a dark, unassuming velvet cloak, and hurry to the western gardens. The sight of Kalen reading by the iron bars became the anchor of her days. But observation soon gave way to an aching, irresistible curiosity. She needed to hear his voice. She needed to know what thoughts occupied the mind of the man who guarded her prison. The opportunity arose on an evening when the sky was bruised with the vibrant purples and deep oranges of a dying autumn sun. A sudden sharp gust of wind swept through the gardens, catching the hood of Alara's cloak and blowing a delicate, embroidered silk handkerchief from her grasp. The fabric danced through the air, fluttering over the stone path, before coming to rest directly against the iron bars of the gate, right at Kalen's heavy leather boots. Alara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched from the shadows as Kalen slowly lowered his book. He bent down, the leather of his armor creaking softly, and picked up the handkerchief. His rough thumb brushed over the silver thread of the royal crest embroidered in the corner. He did not look surprised. Instead, he slowly lifted his gaze, peering directly into the tangled darkness of the willow trees. He had known she was there. Perhaps he had known all along. "It is too cold an evening for a lady of the court to be wandering the outer walls without a lantern," his voice rang out, low and resonant, carrying a rough, gravelly texture that sent a sudden, involuntary shiver down Alara's spine. Summoning a courage she did not know she possessed, Alara stepped out from the shadows. The dying light caught the golden strands of her hair that had escaped her hood, illuminating the pale, aristocratic perfection of her face. Kalen's breath hitched visibly. He knew exactly who she was. The entire kingdom knew the face of the solitary princess. Yet, he did not drop to his knees. He did not bow his head in trembling reverence. He simply stood there, a towering figure of quiet strength, holding her handkerchief through the cold iron bars. "I prefer the dark," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly, before steadying into the regal cadence she had been taught since birth. She stepped closer, closing the distance until only the thick iron separated them. "It is the only time the palace stops demanding things of me." Kalen studied her, his sea storm eyes tracing the exhaustion that lingered beneath her striking features. "The dark is dangerous, Your Highness, especially so close to the edge of the world you know." "And what of the world you know, Gatekeeper?" she asked, her eyes darting to the worn book tucked under his arm. "Is it so dangerous out there?" A slow, melancholic smile touched his lips, transforming his rugged face into something breathtakingly gentle. "It is loud. It is dirty. It is filled with hunger and cold," he replied softly. "But it is alive. The people out there own nothing, yet they own themselves. I look at this palace, Princess, and I see a tomb of beautiful stones." Alara's breath caught. He had voiced the very agony that had been eating at her soul for years. In that single, fleeting exchange, the chasm of their social standing vanished. They were not a royal heir and a penniless guard. They were two prisoners recognizing the bars of each other's cages. She reached out, her small, pale hand taking the handkerchief from his large, calloused one. For a fraction of a second, their fingers brushed. His skin was rough, warm, and real, so incredibly real compared to the polished, sterile perfection of the lords who kissed her hand at court. That touch ignited a fire that neither the thick iron gate nor the immense weight of the kingdom's laws could extinguish. Their secret meetings became a nightly ritual. As the moon rose high, casting long silver shadows across the palace grounds, Ilara would steal away to the western wall. Kalen would be waiting. They spent hours talking through the iron bars, their voices hushed, their faces pressed as close to the cold metal as they dared. He told her of the winding, cobblestone streets of the lower city, of the raucous taverns where sailors sang songs of distant shores, of the smell of baking bread in the morning, and the laughter of children playing in the mud. He painted a world of vibrant, messy freedom that Alara drank in like a dying woman offered water. In return, she told him of her fears, of the crushing weight of the crown she was destined to wear, of the profound loneliness of being surrounded by hundreds of people, yet having no one who truly saw her. Kalen saw her. He saw past the silk and the diamonds, past the title and the royal blood. He saw Ilara, the fierce, intelligent, vulnerable woman who longed to run barefoot through a meadow. And Ilara saw Kalen. She saw a man whose nobility came not from a lineage of kings, but from the purity of his heart and the strength of his character. She fell in love with his rough hands, his deep, rumbling laugh, and the way his eyes softened whenever she appeared from the shadows. She loved the way he listened to her, as if her words were the most precious treasures in the world. But love, when it blooms in the soil of impossibility, brings as much pain as it does joy. The reality of their situation was a constant, looming executioner's axe over their heads. If they were discovered, Ilara would be locked away in a tower, disgraced and ruined. Kaelin, however, would face a far worse fate. He would be tortured and hanged for daring to touch the royal bloodline. This terror ate at Kaelin constantly. As winter began to thaw into a wet, dreary spring, the inevitable storm broke. King Aldrich, eager to secure a military alliance with the neighboring kingdom of Valoria, announced Alara's betrothal to Crown Prince Valerius. Valerius was everything Kaelin was not: wealthy, arrogant, draped in velvet, and cruelly handsome. When he arrived at the palace, he looked at Ilara not as a woman, but as a prize mare to be broken and displayed. The suffocating reality of her cage suddenly began to shrink, crushing the breath from her lungs. That night, Ilara ran to the western gate, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kaelin was there, his face pale and tight with an agony he was desperately trying to conceal. News of the royal betrothal had swept through the guard barracks like wildfire. "You cannot come here anymore, Ilara," Kaelin said, his voice breaking as she pressed her face against the cold iron, reaching her hands through the bars to grasp his tunic. He did not use her title. He had stopped using it months ago. "I won't marry him," she sobbed, her fingers curling into the rough leather of his armor, desperate to pull him closer, desperate to tear down the metal that separated them. "I would rather die, Kaelin. I would rather throw myself from the highest tower than let him touch me." Kaelin closed his eyes, a tear escaping to track down his weathered cheek. He reached through the bars, his large hands gently framing her delicate face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You are the future queen. You are the sun that lights this kingdom. I am the dirt beneath the cobblestones. This was a dream, Ilara. A beautiful, cruel dream. But you must wake up now." "No," she whispered fiercely, leaning her forehead against the iron, her eyes blazing with a defiant, desperate fire. "You are the earth that grounds me. You are the only real thing in my life. If you tell me to go back to that palace, you are condemning me to death." "If you stay with me, I am condemning you to poverty, to disgrace, to a life of running," Kaelin argued, though his hands refused to let go of her face. "I have nothing to give you, my love, nothing but a heart that beats only for you. That is all I have ever wanted," she breathed, closing her eyes as she leaned into his touch. "Take me away, Kaelin. Please, take me away from here." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the sound of the wind rustling the bare branches of the willows and the distant, haunting call of a night bird. Kaelin stared at her, his mind warring between his protective instinct to keep her safe within her golden walls and the overwhelming, undeniable truth that he could not live without her. Slowly, the resolve of a desperate man hardened in his eyes. "The grand betrothal ball isn't 3 days," Kaelin whispered, his voice low and urgent. "The entire palace guard will be focused on the internal security of the citadel. The outer walls will be lightly manned. I will be on duty at the southern postern gate. It is old, rusted, and rarely used." Alara's heart leaped. She nodded, memorizing every word. "When the midnight bells chime, you must be there. Wear nothing that shines. Bring nothing that bears the royal crest. Once we cross that threshold, there is no turning back, Alara. We will be hunted." "I am already hunted by a life I do not want," she replied firmly. "I will be there." The next 3 days were a torturous blur of fittings, banquets, and the suffocating presence of Prince Valerius. Ilara played her part to perfection. She smiled politely, she danced with the grace expected of her, and she allowed her father to boast of the glorious future she was securing for the kingdom. But inside, she was a coiled spring. every beat of her heart was a countdown to midnight. The night of the betrothal ball arrived, bringing with it a violent, unseasonal thunderstorm. The sky cracked with jagged forks of lightning, and rain lashed against the massive stained glass windows of the grand ballroom. Inside, the heat was oppressive. 1,000 candles burned, illuminating the swirling silks, the glittering jewels, and the painted faces of the nobility. The air was thick with heavy perfumes and the cloying smell of roasted meats. The orchestra played a frantic, dizzying waltz. Elara stood at the edge of the dance floor, suffocating. She was dressed in a gown of spun gold and crimson velvet, her bodice encrusted with rubies that felt as heavy as lead. Prince Valerius had just kissed her hand, his lips wet and cold, whispering a crude promise of their wedding night into her ear. Nausea rolled in her stomach. She looked around at the laughing, oblivious faces of the court. They were ghosts, dancing in a gilded mausoleum. She caught the eye of her father, King Aldrich, who raised his goblet to her from the high table. She offered him one final, hollow smile. Then, as the music swelled to a crescendo and the dancers merged into a chaotic blur of color, Elara stepped backward, slipping into the shadows behind a massive marble pillar. She ran. She tore through the empty, echoing corridors of the palace, her golden dress heavy and cumbersome. She reached her private chambers and locked the door behind her. With frantic, trembling hands, she began to strip away the illusion of the princess. She clawed at the rubies, tearing the heavy gown from her body and letting it fall to the floor like a discarded skin. She unpinned her elaborate hairstyle, letting her golden hair tumble freely down her back. She dressed quickly in a simple, dark woolen dress she had stolen from a maid's quarters, pulling her heavy velvet cloak over her shoulders and fastening it tightly. She looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror one last time. Gone was the future queen of Ethelgard. In her place stood a woman, terrified but fiercely alive. The midnight bells began to toll, their deep, mournful chimes echoing through the stone halls. Elara slipped out through the servants' passageways, navigating the dark, narrow stone steps that led down to the lower levels of the citadel. The sound of the ball faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the roaring of the storm outside. When she finally pushed open a heavy oak door and stepped out into the night, the wind hit her like a physical blow. The rain was torrential, instantly soaking through her cloak, plastering her hair to her face and turning the manicured lawns into treacherous mud. She fought her way through the darkness, keeping to the shadows of the high walls, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every flash of lightning made her freeze in terror, fearful of being spotted by a patrolling guard. But the storm was her ally, driving the sentries into their sheltered posts. She reached the southern postern gate. It was a small, heavy iron door set deep into the ancient stone of the outer wall, half hidden by overgrown thorny vines. Standing before it, a dark silhouette against the stormy night, was Kalen. He was drenched, his leather armor dark and slick with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. But when the lightning illuminated his face, the chaos of the storm. "I told you," she panted, looking up at him, the rain washing away the last traces of the palace from her face. "I am yours." Kalen didn't waste another second. He turned to the heavy gate, pulling a massive, rusted iron key from his belt. He thrust it into the lock, the metal grinding and groaning in protest. With a powerful heave of his shoulders, he forced the mechanism to turn. A loud, sharp clack echoed over the sound of the rain. He pushed his weight against the heavy iron door, and with a terrible screech of rusted hinges, it swung open. Beyond the gate lay the sprawling, chaotic darkness of the lower city, its narrow alleys winding away into the unknown. It was dangerous, uncertain, and completely devoid of the safety Elara had known her entire life. Kalen turned back to her, holding out his hand. Rain dripped from his jaw, but his expression was one of absolute, terrifying devotion. "Last chance, Elara. Once we step through, we are outcasts. We will have nothing." Elara looked back over her shoulder. High above, the lighted windows of the grand ballroom glowed like distant, cold stars. She could almost hear the music, the false laughter, the clinking of gold. Then she looked at Kalen, at his strong, calloused hand reaching out to her in the darkness. She saw the books he read, the kindness in his soul, the freedom in his eyes. She saw a life of hardship, yes, but a life of truth, a life of love. She placed her hand firmly in his. "We will have everything," she said. Together, they stepped through the iron gate, disappearing into the storm and the shadows. Kalen pulled the heavy door shut behind them, the iron locking with a definitive hollow thud that severed Alara from her past forever. They ran through the winding, muddy streets, their hands tightly intertwined, the rain washing away their footprints. They did not stop until the towering walls of the palace were nothing but a dark smudge against the storming horizon. Dawn broke hours later, a pale, hesitant light creeping over a distant, unfamiliar landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, cleansed world that smelled of wet earth and pine. Alara awoke in a small, drafty room of a roadside inn miles away from the capital. The bed was hard, the blankets were rough wool, and the air was cold. There were no maids to light a fire, no silk sheets, no silver trays bearing sweet pastries. She turned her head. Kalen was sitting in a wooden chair by the small, cracked window, watching her. He had shed his guard's tunic, wearing only a simple linen shirt. He looked exhausted, the shadows deep under his eyes. But as she stirred, a smile broke across his face, a smile so radiant, so completely unburdened that it stole the breath from her lungs. He came to the bed, sitting beside her and gently brushing a tangled lock of golden hair from her face. His rough fingers lingered on her cheek, warm and infinitely tender. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely contain. Alara looked around the sparse, humble room, and then back into the deep, stormy sea of his eyes. She reached up, placing her hand over his, pressing his palm against her skin. She had never been so cold, so hungry, and so entirely stripped of her identity. Yet, as she looked at the gatekeeper who had stolen her heart and unlocked her cage, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. "Good morning," she replied, her voice steady and full of joy. She pulled him down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of rain, of freedom, and of a love that had defied a kingdom.